A fundamental characteristic of a lens is its focal length. Lenses are identified by their focal length, which is measured in millimeters, and when we are talking about a lens, we will refer to it by its focal length. For instance, a 50mm lens or an 18 to 55mm lens. While the optical construction of modern lenses makes measurement of the focal length quite complex, the focal length can be thought of as the distance the light travels from the lens to the sensor. Focal length does not match the physical size of the lens, with lenses that have short focal lengths typically being longer than their own focal length, while lenses with long focal lengths are often shorter than their own focal length. So for instance, this is a 12mm lens, but we can see it's quite a lot longer than 12mm, while this over here is a 55 to 200mm lens. We can see when it's zoomed in, it's longer than 55mm, and when it's zoomed out, it's still shorter than 200mm. Focal length is important because it determines the angle of view a lens creates. Angle of view is how we describe how much of a scene we can see through a lens. Lenses with a short focal length have a wide angle of view, allowing us to include a lot of the scene we are photographing, while lenses with a long focal length have a narrow angle of view, allowing us to pick out smaller parts of a scene to photograph. With this set of example images, we will compare how lenses with different focal lengths will depict a scene if they are all used from the same point of view. You will notice that while the part of the scene that is visible in the photograph changes, the relative size and position of objects in the frame remain the same. So you will see when we start off with a focal length of 12mm, we are seeing a relatively wide angle of view of the scene, and then as the focal length gets longer through 18, 23, 35mm and so forth, we progressively see less of the scene. But in all instances, the size and position of the objects relative to one another in the frame remains the same. It is important to note that the angle of view from a particular lens is dependent both on its focal length and on the size of the sensor we are using it with. When used with the same lens, a smaller sensor will give us a narrower angle of view, while a larger sensor will give us a wider angle of view. This is because the smaller sensor records a smaller section of the image produced by the lens than a larger section would. Provided the lens has the correct mount, lenses made for full-frame sensors can be used on cameras with cropped sensors, but lenses made for cropped sensors can't be used on full-frame cameras since they create an image circle that does not cover a whole full-frame sensor. So in this example, the circular image depicts the image circle produced by a full-frame lens. And you will notice when we superimpose a full-frame sensor on that, it extends right to the edges of the circular image. But when we superimpose a crop sensor on it, we are covering a much smaller part of the circular image that doesn't extend to the edges of the frame. Similarly, our crop sensor lenses also produce a circular image, and when we superimpose a crop sensor on that circular image, it extends right to the corners of the frame. However, if we superimpose a full-frame sensor on the crop sensor image, we will notice that it sticks out past the edges of the image circle, and parts of our frame will record as pure black. To help us compare cropped sensor and full-frame lenses, camera manufacturers will usually state a crop factor for crop sensor cameras. Crop factors are used to determine the focal length that would give us an equivalent angle of view if we were using a full-frame camera. So for example, if we are using a 50mm lens on a camera with a 1.5 crop factor, such as a Nikon, Fujifilm or Sony crop sensor camera, we multiply 50 by 1.5 to arrive at 75mm, which is the focal length that will give us an equivalent angle of view on a full-frame camera. Similarly, if we are using a Canon camera with a 1.6 crop factor and the same 50mm lens, we multiply 50mm by 1.6 to give us 80mm. The difference in equivalent focal length does not mean there is anything different about the lens, but rather that the slightly smaller sensor on the Canon camera will give us a narrower angle of view even if we use the same lens. To help us to understand the angle of view we will get from our lenses, they are often grouped into categories based on their focal length. The three basic groupings are standard lenses, wide-angle lenses, and telephoto lenses. Standard or normal lenses have a focal length that is similar to the diagonal measurement of the sensor they are made to be used with. So for instance, a full-frame sensor, which measures 36 by 24mm, has a diagonal measurement of 43mm, and standard lenses for full-frame cameras typically have a focal length close to that, most commonly 50mm. Because cropped sensors are smaller than full-frame ones, standard lenses for cropped sensors have a shorter focal length, Most crop sensor cameras have a sensor measuring 24 by 16 millimeters with a diagonal measurement of about 30 millimeters. Standard lenses for crop sensors have a focal length close to that, with 35 millimeters being the most common. Standard lenses have an angle of view similar to what we see through one eye without peripheral vision, and because their angle of view is neither very wide nor very narrow, they also tend not to distort or compress the scenes we photograph, giving us images with a very natural perspective which resembles our own vision. In this first example image by Annie Leibovitz, we can see that the perspective of the image is quite natural. The size of near and distant elements appear as we would normally perceive them. Similarly, in this photograph by Mary Ellen Mark, we can see that the children are larger than the background, but not in a way that makes them appear distorted. Lastly, in this image by Andreas Gursky, we can see that the shelving in the store does diminish in size as it moves further away towards the back wall, but that diminishment of size appears quite natural and appears very similar to how we would see it with our own eyes if we were viewing the scene physically standing there. Lenses with a focal length shorter than the standard length for the format they are used with are called wide-angle lenses, and those with very short focal lengths, usually shorter than 24 millimeters on a full-frame camera, are referred to as super wide. These two lenses shown here with focal lengths of 24 and 28 millimeters respectively are typical examples of wide-angle lenses made to be used with a full-frame camera. On a crop sensor, any lens shorter than 35 millimeters is considered a wide-angle lens, while super wides have focal lengths shorter than 16 millimeters. These two lenses shown here with focal lengths of 16 and 23 millimeters respectively are typical examples of wide-angle lenses made to be used on cropped sensor cameras. Because wide-angle lenses allow us to compose with near and more distant elements in the same frame, they tend to exaggerate the size of those objects close to the camera, while distant objects will look small by comparison. This effect is most pronounced when those objects that are close to the camera are positioned towards the edges of the frame, in which case their shape may also be distorted, seeming to stretch towards the edges of the frame. Because of the exaggerated perspective we get from wide-angle lenses, images made with them may appear less natural, especially when we use lenses with an extremely short focal length and when we position objects very close to the camera. In our first example image by British photographer Clayton, we can see that there is a very exaggerated perspective where the subject, George W. Bush, his hand appears much larger than his head, even though we know that that's not really the case, and that's because the hand is much closer to the camera while the photographer is using a wide-angle lens. In our second example by Susan Mycelis, we can see that the figure in the middle of the frame appears much larger than the other figures because she is positioned much closer to the camera, and we can also see that the buildings diminish in size with distance. Both of these effects are due to the use of a wide-angle lens. In our final example image by Sebastião Salgado, we can also see how objects diminish in size with distance and how noticeable that is when we use a wide-angle lens. If we look at the figures in the frame, we can see those figures at the bottom of the frame that are closer to the camera appear much larger than those at the top of the frame, while the pillars in the image appear much wider at the top than they do at the bottom. Lenses with longer than standard focal lengths are called telephoto lenses, and those with very long focal lengths, usually longer than 300 millimeters on a full-frame camera, are called super telephoto lenses. The smaller lens of this pair is an 85mm telephoto lens, while the larger one is a 400mm super telephoto lens. Lenses with focal lengths longer than 35mm are considered telephoto lenses if we use them on a crop sensor camera. Super telephoto lenses for crop sensor cameras have focal lengths longer than 200mm. Here we have two crop sensor telephoto lenses with focal lengths of 56mm and 200mm respectively. In our first image example by Sam Abel, we can see that the scene looks like an extract from a much wider landscape, and the characteristic compression or stacking together of distant elements is quite evident towards the top of the frame, where the hills in the distance appear to be quite close together. In our second example by South African photographer Kevin Carter, we can see how the use of a long focal length lens makes it look as if the vulture is looming over the child, even though in reality the distance between them is quite large. Our final example, by American photographer Ansel Adams, again uses a long focal length lens to compress distant elements in the frame. We can see how the mountain in the distance and the hill in the foreground appear to be compressed quite close together, and how the distant mountain thus looms over the hill in the foreground, and that in turn looms over the trees and the elk in the foreground of the photograph.